Hey, welcome to class. It is Tuesday, June 1st, getting into the summer. I hope you guys are doing well. This week's class will be on Chapter 5 of the Birkeland book, which is about unofficial stakeholders and actors in policymaking. So only Chapter 5 of the Birkeland will be on your quiz. We'll do what's slotted for the next 3 days next week, I believe. Maybe some of it the week after. So, in this lesson, we're going to be talking about individual citizens as policy actors. Now, we don't generally consider individual citizens to be official actors in the policy-making system. However, they are definitely unofficial actors, as they vote and participate in the policy process in other ways. We're going to talk about interest groups and political parties and their influence on the political or the public policy system, as well as think tanks and other research organizations, and communications media, as well as subgovernments, issue networks, and domains. So, when we're thinking about how individual citizens are policy actors, we're first confronted with the reality that there are very few opportunities for individual participation in the policy process, and we know that also that voter turnout has historically been very low. However, there are a number of ways that individual participants can participate in the policy process, such as writing to elected officials, attending public meetings or hearings, circulating petitions, joining groups, lobbying officials, and engaging in peaceful protests. And I'm sure all of you, or at least some of you, have engaged in the policy process in at least some of these ways. However, you may be curious as to how you can increase your participation in the policy process, and those are some suggestions. So, if you're interested in a particular issue, you can write to your local Congress people, you can circulate petitions, you can attend public meetings or hearings, you can engage in peaceful protests, and join groups and lobby officials. And those are all various ways that you can participate in the policy process at all of its stages. And one thing that we need to consider when we're talking about individual citizens as policy actors is what individuals expect the government to do. And according to Florina, people want the most benefits at the least costs, and for other people to pay for the benefits we receive. You may agree or disagree with Florina's assessment there. However, it does seem to be generally the case that people want to get the most bang for their buck, or at least the most efficiency and effectiveness out of government, which means, in effect, that people want to get the most out of the fewest actions or the least amount of money. And often people want other people to bear the brunt of the work or the costs for the services they receive. So if this is the case, then individuals need to be regular, dynamic actors in the policy process such that they can achieve their needs and wants. And one way that individuals work as policy actors is through mobilization, which is the process by which people or groups are motivated to take action, such as through lobbying, protests, or any other form of expression in response to an issue or problem. So this falls into the part of the policy cycle that we refer to as generally agenda setting. People become mobilized by the existence or prevalence of a particular policy issue or problem to take action with respect to that policy issue or problem, and then begin setting the agenda with respect to how they, as individual actors in the, or at least unofficial actors in the policy system, are going to achieve their desires. And we also need to define the public interest, which we have already done, but we're coming back to it. And again, the public interest is the assumed broader desires and needs of the public, in whose name policy is made. It's hard to define, but is something to which all policy advocates appeal. And Lowy here notes that American government is more concerned with the distribution of benefits to particular interests. So when we talk about the public interest, we're generally conceiving of the public as a unified whole. However, public interests can also be defined with respect to the disparate interests of each individual citizen who is an unofficial actor in the policy process, and thus sometimes the government has to appeal to particular interests to satisfy the needs and desires of the public. And this often comes about through interest groups and lobbying for particular issues in government and the mobilization of particular populations, demographics, or issue networks. So, interest groups. Interest groups are collections of individuals whose actions are amplified by working together. And interest groups probably predate the making of the United States of America because federalism has led to what could we say, many factions being created in America with respect to particular policy issues and issue networks, and iron triangles, and the like. Because of the separation of the federal and the state and local governments, people have to advocate for their issues, needs, desires, etc., to solve problems at various arenas, or within various arenas, and these factions are generally known as interest groups. And interest groups are defined in the Brooklyn as a collection of people or organizations that unite to advance their desired political outcomes in government and society. There are many different ways to organize these groups by types of interests, such as public, private, institutional, and economical. So, institutional interest groups are a group of people, usually not formally constituted, whose members are part of the same institution or organization. For example, an institutional interest group would be the students of Wayne State, or the faculty of Wayne State, or the Wayne State community itself. Economic and private interest groups are groups formed to promote and defend the economic interests of their members, such as labor unions for various organizations. And public interest groups are groups formed to promote what its members believe is in the broader public interest. And generally we think about environmental groups when we think about public interest groups, because the environment is one thing that we can all say we have in common, or at least have an interest in preserving. Or at least the public does. Perhaps, the private corporations do not. Although some may say that they do. And interest groups have rapidly expanded since the 1960s. And we define peak associations and peak organizations as the largest and most influential groups in a policy domain. These tend to be the groups that lead other like-minded individuals and groups in advocacy coalitions. Examples include the National Rifle Association and the American Medical Association. So the more money, knowledge, and information, and generally the larger the size and the amount of resources an interest group has access to, the more likely they're going to fall into a peak association or peak organization category. So the larger an interest group is, generally we want to think the more powerful they are. And then the next unofficial actor in the policy process is political parties. And political parties are essential functionaries in the policy process. And party labels this is because party labels provide cues to voters for who to vote for across the board and to help them align with issues and platforms. And political parties are crucial to the organization of the legislative branch. Congress and the state legislators elect their leaders along party lines, and committee assignments and other positions are made on the basis of party alignment. So not only are representatives to the government elected on the basis of party lines, but they kind of operate within the government on the basis of party lines as well. And then the second to last group that we're going to talk about with respect to interest groups is think tanks and other research organizations. So these come about because of the existence of complex problems combined with the need for increased analytic capacity, which has led to the growth of independent research organizations called think tanks. And the Brooklyn defines them as independent research organizations, sometimes ideologically neutral, but often identified with a political party. And they employ scholars and policy experts and help policymakers make informed policy. And what the policy ends up being informed by via think tanks and other research organizations can be either neutral or ideologically driven, and this depends on who funds the think tank or what organization the think tank is associated with. So we generally think that think tanks or research organizations associated with universities are more ideologically neutral than think tanks and other research organizations that are funded by private organizations. And then we have the communications media, which serves as the fourth branch of government, in a sense, or so we call it, which is, in a sense, it's a sort of check on the other three branches of government. Now, we know that the media is biased in various ways, depending on which news source we're talking about. Some are more or less trustworthy, more or less informed, more or less biased, etc. Or, I'm sorry, I forgot where I was going with that. But we know that the press today does consist of magazines, newspapers, radio, and television, as well as social media, websites, blogs, and podcasts. And we have the definition of muckrakers here, which are the investigative journalists of the early 20th century whose work exposed problems such as tainted food, dangerous working conditions, and bogus medicines. And the term muckraker was coined by Teddy Roosevelt. And we know that when we're talking about the communications media, print news media has definitely declined in popularity, but sometimes print news organizations maintain active subscribers in some cities, as well as through popular websites they maintain their subscribers or their membership network. And the most popular news TV channels are Fox News and MSNBC, which represent the right and the left respectively. And we know sometimes that communications media is susceptible to echo chambers and fake news. Echo chambers referring to the idea that particular voices and ideas get amplified within particular areas that are focused on people with particular views. And fake news refers to news at its false. But we also know that the communications media has an agenda-setting function, and this is through the fact that greater levels of news coverage are clearly associated with greater levels of institutional attention to public problems, and the news media also expands issues from narrow groups to broader audiences, creating more pressure for change. But biases that are introduced in news coverage based on competitive and economic needs of news outlets can result in a particular news station or story being swayed to a particular party and agenda. So, like, the dramatic and the narrative features of the story over sometimes matter more than substantive importance. We see this with the sensationalization of violence, for example. And this is why sometimes people think that the news is all bad news. This is because it gets more viewership, right? So the news has to be taken with a grain of salt, but generally, particularly if you read the news, you will be more informed on the issues that are going on in the policy process or the stages of the policy process. However, you must take everything with a grain of salt and know that sometimes only one perspective is being provided, especially if a newscaster is editorializing on an issue rather than just reporting facts. Okay, and then near the end of the article, the chapter, we talk about subgovernments, issue networks, and domains. And policy domains are the substantive area of policy over which participants in policymaking compete and compromise, such as the environmental policy domain or the healthcare policy domain. So policy domains just refer to different areas of policy, whether it be education, healthcare, labor laws, things like this. But then we also have policy communities, which are the group of actors, such as interest groups, government agencies, the media, and elected officials, that is actively involved in policy making in a particular domain. This group is generally thought of as being much more open and dynamic than an iron triangle or subgovernment. And an iron triangle is a particular style of subgovernment in which there are mutually reinforcing relationships between a regulated interest, the agency charged with that regulation, and the congressional subcommittee charged with policymaking in that interest area. So we see iron triangles in all sorts of policy domains and policy communities. Usually they have to do with business interests, but that's not a necessary condition of an iron triangle. Just think about where you see the coordination of regulated interests, the agency charged with regulation, and the congressional subcommittee charged with policy making in that interest area. And sometimes in iron triangles we see the reiteration of particular forms of policy over time, and several forms of policy restraint in play. And that can be due to the reinforcing nature of the iron triangle, and that's why it's called an iron triangle instead of just like an issue network triangle or something like that. And then we also have the definition of log rolling in this section, which is the legislative practice of trading commitments to vote for members' preferred policies. We see this in lots of political TV shows where, like for example on Parks and Rec, Leslie sometimes trades votes with Jam, who's like the antagonist of one of the antagonists of the show, and who's very... It's portrayed as Jam is more selfishly motivated, whereas Leslie cares about the good of the people, or, the government's best interests with respect to the public interest. And sometimes she'll have to vote for Jam's proposal to secure a vote on Leslie's proposal. Similarly, you'll see this on shows like The West Wing or Veep, which I think are really actually not entirely accurate representations of the public policy process, but they definitely shed some light and some humorous forms of criticism on some of the aspects of policy making for sure. And then we also get some more definitions in this section. That's basically how we're concluding this PowerPoint. So we have the Freedom of Information Act, which is a federal law that allows citizens to gain information about government processes through a specified procedure. And we have the definition of subgovernment, which is a policy network or subsystem that is most involved in making policy in a particular domain. So you can think about the government being subdivided between several different policy domains, and each of these domains can be defined as a subgovernment. And then issue network is a term that describes the relationships between the various actors and interests in a particular policy issue. Heckler promoted this term because it describes a more open policy-making system that contains more actors and relationships than the old iron triangle concept. So issue network is broader than the iron triangle concept, which again is a triangle of reinforcing relationships between a regulated interest, the government agency charged with regulating that interest, and the subcommittee devoted to it, whereas an issue network can encompass more types of actors, including unofficial actors such as individual citizens, the news media, issue, interest groups, and other types of actors, like lobbyists, that can work together in concert on a particular policy issue or against each other, but they are still part of the same issue network because they are dealing with the same particular policy issue. And then finally we have policy regime, which is a system of policies intended to achieve broad policy goals such as homeland security. So whereas an issue network, it doesn't really have a particular direction with respect to what they're trying to accomplish, a policy regime, hence the keyword there is regime, has a directed goal that they are trying to accomplish through progressive security measures, for example, with respect to the policy problem of how to enhance Homeland Security. And part of that was, enacting the war on terrorism after the 9/11 attacks that is still ongoing in the Middle East. Although the last troops remaining in Afghanistan are due to return by the end of the year. So that could be part of the end of it, but we know it's still ongoing. Okay, so that's all that we're going to go over for this week. Again, Quiz 3 will only be on this chapter, of which I have a PowerPoint up that I just reviewed in the module section. And next week we'll go over Chapter 6 of the Birkeland and some of the Bardock, I believe. And if you have any questions about anything, your policy analysis paper, the quizzes, the final exam, anything in the class, if you just want to discuss public policy, just let me know. Send me an email. I'm always available. I'm not always available, but I try to be as available as possible within reason and certain boundary limits. And for this week, I'm holding my office hours tomorrow from 9 to 11 a.m. instead of having them yesterday, which was Memorial Day. So, yeah, my office hours will be on Wednesday, June 2nd from 9 to 11 a.m. And that's about it. So I hope you guys have a great week. If you have any questions or concerns, reach out to me as always. See you next time.